Hi there, and greetings and blessings to you. Let's talk about Saturn moving into Aries, which is a really big thing, and I'm also really wondering how you're feeling, how you're doing with that. Because, of course, before Saturn goes into Aries, it's hanging out on the last degrees of Pisces, on the 29th degrees of Pisces for the last days and the last weeks already. It's been approaching this moment, and that is a very, very very significant closing moment. It is the true omega, it's a true closing of the zodiac, the true closing of this reflection, which the zodiac basically is, of our human consciousness and our experience on planet Earth. And so the very last degree of the zodiac is this very big, critical moment, critical degree. And since Saturn is all the structures in our lives, our own inner structures, the structures of our mind, the structures of our ego, and the unconscious defense mechanisms is Saturn, but also the outer structures of our lives, how we structure our day, the society, the institutions, the roads, the traffic, how it flows, how it functions, how it stabilizes our being, is also Saturn. And Saturn closing its cycle in the zodiac is just like every Saturn cycle, every 30 years, a moment where it might feel like that there's a lot of dissolution and dissolving and washing away or evaporating even of these old structures, all these kind of Pisces words. And so this is also why and how I'm wondering how you're doing, because part of this energy at this moment is definitely one of deep exhaustion and deep grief and very profound crises and crises of meaning, crises of faith and belief, and what we even still believe in or have trust in, or where and how do we feel like life has any meaning, any inherent meaning at all. All of these, which are also structures, come undone right now. Even more so, of course, because Saturn is not just closing its cycle through the zodiac itself, but also about to meet up with Neptune, which will only truly happen by the beginning of next year, I think in like February 2026, February or March 2026. But the entire year, they're less than a degree away, moving together into Aries and then moving together back into Pisces later on in September and October. So that's one part that definitely deserves and needs attention before we can even begin to comprehend what Saturn in Aries is truly about for us personally, but also collectively, for the year ahead, for all the crisis and all the change that we're living through, but also all the courage and instinct and will and power and clarity of action that Aries will want to impel us to move into in hopefully a positive and aligned and conscious way. We'll also see and explore the downsides or the shadow reflection of these kinds of quote-unquote positive Aries qualities, which Saturn and Aries will definitely also bring up, right? It's neither fully this nor fully that, and it never truly is, especially on the world stage with 8 billion plus human beings and countless other plants and animal and spirit beings in between, which are also all affected and in resonant to that field, which Saturn in the end only reflects, right? The age-old question of if the planets are signs or if they are causes, and they tie in, I think, really well with this consideration of Saturn moving into Aries, which will happen, by the way, on Saturday to Sunday on the 25th. It'll be like Sunday early morning in the States, and Sunday midday here in Europe. Before it goes back into Pisces, September 1st. So we have basically all of June, July, and August, 3 months of Saturn in Aries as a kind of first opening and first foreshadowing and first imprint of this energy in the field, before we'll have another 5.5 months of Saturn in Pisces for a last hooray, a last closing shop, but also last dissolution of these aforementioned structures, personally and collectively, ahead of us. But the consideration whether the planets are reflecting or causing anything, I think fits in very well here for just a second, because of course Saturn is a lot of time, but also a lot of karma, We need linear time for karma, the consequences to our actions, to play out and be reflected back to us. And as long as we act in the world and identify with our actions, we're creating more karmas, which then will bear fruit, for better or worse, in linear time. And these are what we can call the karmic contracts, which Saturn is a lot of. But since Saturn's linearity in what we perceive to be linear time plays out as a kind of law which we're all bound to, and Saturn now at the very end of the zodiac might feel like a huge releasing, but also a sense of a void that opens up through that, because it's not just, it's out with the old and there's the brand new beautiful things that are emerging, but there's also, of course, the other graver side of Saturn, of melancholy and depression, and the collective grief, the collective heaviness of Saturn in Pisces, the waters, that we feel with all the crises in the world, as long at least as we open our eyes to it, and open our heart, and don't get trapped in the propaganda and the deceit and the corruption and the lies about it all, but really honestly, earnestly, sincerely meet it. And that is not just meeting what is going on in the world, but it's also meeting us. And that is what Saturn ultimately does. He is that mirror of reality that constantly reflects our quote-unquote karmas back to us, so that we can take conscious, deliberate responsibility for them, that we can become conscious co-creators with reality and don't put blame and shame and guilt external and make anybody out there responsible for our own lives, which most of us human beings tend to do. And that, just to close that tiny loophole which I opened up here with, if Saturn is mirroring that this is happening to us collectively, or he's causing it because now he's changing from this one zodiac sign to the other, is, I think, both not a deep enough understanding of what time and the nature of time really is, of which Saturn, right, again, is said to be the Lord. And that is that the movement of Saturn is just like everything else, in reality, a reflection of deeper archetypal wave dynamics. And in that way, he's not causing it, but he's also not causing it. The movement of Saturn, he, she, it, whatever it is, this planetary being, this god or deity, this archetypal function in the psyche and the collective unconscious, it is an embodiment of a specific type of energy which we tend to associate with Saturn, the wise and strict teacher, because that is a function of reality. And so Saturn's movement from the end of the zodiac to the very beginning of the zodiac shows us that we are also approaching this switch in reality, which we feel every 2.5 years when Saturn changes a sign. But really, that the cycle closes is like one part of a kind of celestial harmonics in the field finishing, right? And showing us that there's a whole new set of timelines, if you want to call them that, about to begin here. And I wish we would all feel just the joyful, elated, courageous, adventurous energy of Aries, in the way that we can feel like the lightness of it and the excitement of these new timelines, these new adventures, these new frontiers, which Saturn and Aries will be so much about. But that would be neglecting and trying to bypass the depth of Saturn and Neptune closing their cycle together, which just creates a lot of this feeling that the dreams and visions and aspirations, Neptune, where and how we place ultimate meaning, and how we structure that then in the world, Saturn, how we try to bring that about in a concrete reality, in a concrete, tangible way, is also dissolving, it's also ending. Them meeting, them closing their cycle is just like the new moon. It's a closing of the Saturn-Neptune dynamics. The last time they came together was 1989, which was, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the ending of the Cold War, the dissolving of the UdSSR, And quite a few things that many people living through that never expected to would have happened at some point at all, right? The Saturn, the wall was there. Everybody in the world was like, oh no, that's never going away. And suddenly, in a magical kind of way, Neptune, this reality was dissolved, and greater Neptune, greater cohesiveness, greater unity could come back to that part of the world at least. Even though this other part of unity, the UdSSR, did dissolve and splinter into all the individual Eastern European states. And that's another thing with Saturn-Neptune and the Saturn-Neptune cycle per se, is that it has this huge resonance to the ideas of socialism and communism. So historically, over centuries, you can track the Saturn and Neptune cycle in both the Chinese and the Russian history especially, but also in all the other Western countries where the ideas of strong socialism or even communism, Marxism, and so on are prevalent or have been playing a role or do play a role currently in the politics or the zeitgeist of what and how people approach how a state should be governed, how humanity should live with each other, right? But then there's also, of course, the very dark side of Saturn-Neptune cycles, where on the idea or ideals of these kinds of, oh, everything belongs to everybody, a very Neptunian ideal, but we're going to enforce that from a top-down governmental layer, the Saturn's side, by control and structure and punishment and judgment if you don't follow that, created out of this seemingly beautiful ideal some of the worst tragedies in humanity. In both China with the Red Revolutions, under Mao, under Stalin in the UdSSR, but also in World War II Germany. It was also very strongly colored by this kind of group thinking, which again we see currently right now in the world playing out again, where it's not about one political idea or ideal so much, but about a sense of identity, which is an Aries archetype, and the fear of that feeling threatened. It doesn't even have to be an actual fact, which in the case of Gaza, it isn't, but it's enough to entice and brainwash and delude an entire population into othering the other and making them the enemy, and thus creating cleansing. Neptune cleanses, Neptune washes away, but with Saturn and Neptune there can be ethnic cleansing. Entire populations, entire statehoods, Saturn, have to be washed away, and they have Aries, they are maybe the bad ones, they are attacking us, they are evil, right? And there's also the glamour of Neptune, the twistedness of Neptune that we're also feeling here. So very, very intense, heavy topics, but also on the personal level, like I just said, the Saturn and Neptune cycle is closing, and that just corresponds to how deeply the old structures and forms, Saturn, where we placed our ideals and our yearning for absolution and our yearning for transcendence, our yearning for ultimate, absolute, spiritual, philosophical, religious meaning are falling apart or ending. And that this dance of them also happens at the end of Pisces and early Aries is even more special. Their cycle is 37 years long, but that it happens at this very end point of the zodiac, with the conjunction happening exactly on 0 degrees of Aries next year, is a monumentous thing. And this is also why I think and say and feel that 2025, 2026 is actually much bigger than 2020, even though in a very, very different way. And I don't know yet what will happen, and in the end, I'm an absolute optimist, I guess you could say. I do have a very deep sense of trust and faith in the collective evolution and in the awakening of humanity. And yet I tragically, of course, also have to realize and see then that in order for us to birth this new world, a new reality, a new humanity that I think everybody who watches something like what I'm saying right now wishes for, having to realize that a lot of the world, a lot of the general population still has to be shaken out of their complacency and dissociation and disconnection in a way which probably has to shock them a bit more. And I can't say I'm looking forward to that. I'm not predicting anything here. I don't think there will be a collective big war, even though there are, of course, powers that very much push for that. But that doesn't mean that there won't be a lot of strife and struggle and aggression and fire, Aries, in the field the next years, which maybe on a deeper level has to serve this purpose also of awakening humanity. But I guess you can see that I don't want to relativize anything here. I don't want to relativize any personal or collective suffering that anybody endures. And I would strongly oppose what is happening in many parts of the world right now, whether that's the Ukraine and Russia proxy war of the NATO, or whether that's the ethnic cleansing in Gaza or Sudan, and so on and so forth. And that is a very tricky thing to hold also personally, as an astrologer myself, but also personally, to stay and stick with these deeper, quote-unquote, spiritual perspective and truths, but still keeping the heart open to the suffering and knowing that whatever is happening right now is wrong, and not using these concepts to bypass any of that. And that is the challenge that Saturn and Pisces will continue to hold up, even though it's now about to enter Aries. But from September to middle of February 2026, it will be back in Pisces. And it holds this very strong collective mirror to how much capacity do we have to meet the collective and personal human suffering, to hold space, Saturn, for the entire ocean of emotion, as perplexing and overwhelming and confusing it might be, as much as it might feel us, make us feel powerless in the face of it. Very deep Saturn and Pisces lesson, and that's corresponding to very deep collective exhaustion or overwhelm right now. And I hope we don't see much more outer manifestations of that, but I also know that the powers that create these kinds of things are, I don't even have words. I don't even have words for what they are. Don't feel quite human. Anyhow, long introduction to Saturn and Aries, but I hope you could follow me, because all of these things are really important to understand the position that Saturn and Aries will bring out in us personally, but also collectively. With Pisces, there can be a tendency to just be adrift and use that also as a spiritual bypassing of oh, I'm trusting the flow, I'm trusting the current, God is taking care of it. And that is a deep Pisces lesson, to have deep faith and trust, and to realize that we are not the ultimate agent here that is in charge, that there is higher and deeper forces, that they have a much more mysterious flow to them. But that can also very easily lead to this other Piscean energy, which is a very subtle or a very overt and strong victim consciousness of feeling, I can't do anything, I'm not in charge, I don't have what does my will or my power or my agency matter? And I guess you can see where we're going with this. Saturn in Aries now will strongly challenge all of that. And he will bring up all the ways in which we personally, but also collectively over the last years or even decades, also with Neptune and Pisces, but also all these collective things, all the corruption and greed and exploitation that we see on the world stage, all this othering, and not just in the last year, since decades and decades, created maybe a very strong feeling and resentment in many people also, of feeling a certain sense of powerlessness, and in that way feeling victimized by the world, and like their own power doesn't matter. And Saturn in Aries will talk so much about that, and that can also lead to all this pent-up energy and the emotions that maybe Saturn try to suppress here, the ego function, the ego defense mechanism, like I said in the beginning of Saturn, trying to suppress or deny or control certain emotional expressions, not really holding space for them with compassion and insight, can create and has created a lot of anger and a lot of rage and a lot of resentment, personally and collectively. And Saturn in Aries will bring a lot of that out, where people will feel very fed up and will feel like, I've had it until here, and now the time for action comes. And it can come out maybe in a very uncontrolled or uncontrolled way, uncontrolled aggressive way, right? Just feeling like I need to get some sense of agency, I need to get some sense of power back to me, so I might do whatever it takes, and something brash and instinctive, but not on the good Aries instinctive side that I want to talk about. But this just like explosive fire of Mars, of Aries, of anger, that we might also see and witness a lot, right, over the coming weeks, and especially the next 3 months with Saturn and Aries. The first kind of like, hooray, let's check out what this is. The other side, of course, is the new emergence of new timelines, of new myths, of new stories, of new modes of meaning, of new beliefs, because the collective exhaustion or disillusionment with the old patterns, with the old stories that don't give anything more, that don't give substance. Saturn is substance, Saturn is tangible, right? And where and how people, and we collectively need to let go of a lot of collective timelines, a lot of collective stories and myths and mythologies that underlie our personal and our collective world and worldviews. Saturn and Aries will bring out so many new ones, and they will be strongly focused on this Aries archetype of Aries, ruled by Mars, the warrior with the sword in the hand, fighting for what he believes in instinctively, not knowing the full plan, not knowing exactly what will come out of it, but knowing just in the deepest instinct of their body, like I have to take up the fight, kind of, for my own self, for my own individualization, for my own heart, for my own desires, for my own values, for what I believe in the world. And you again can probably see the two-edged sword here, where that can be a very deeply healing thing for us personally, also to step out of old patterns of victim consciousness, which not just the last years or the last 13 years with Neptune and Pisces could have deepened even more, but the last 2,000 years, moving out of the age of Pisces, since around the time of Christ, we were moving through the Piscean age, and that just created in the entire humanity, no matter if you're born a Christian or in a Christian country right now, a very strong collective overlay of a certain victim mentality and a certain like, what does my will matter here, right? So stepping out of that will be a big theme over the next couple of years, where the hero, the adventurer, the daredevil, the maverick, right? A bit of a juvenile, a bit of an, maybe you could like put it in some spiritual language and say like unconscious masculine energy. And I really don't necessarily agree with that, but you will probably hear a lot of that terminology flying around the next months and years, can be equated to that energy, because there is a naive youthfulness in this Aries drive, which does feel very quote-unquote masculine, very young. But that is something that will also be deeply healing to us, and where all of these new frontiers and borders of where and how we can learn to exercise our will and learn to exercise our instincts and our power, and how that is revitalizing and gives eros back, gives the libido for life back, this erotic energy, which is, again, there's Mars, there's the desire to conquer, there's the desire to conquer life, and that is a very erotic thing, but that is also very vitalizing and revitalizing for the world, for the collective, and for people personally, especially if you have been feeling adrift or confused, right? And to just have that clarity on what and how to act. Saturn also controls though, right? So Saturn in Aries can at first also show up all the ways that you have suppressed or controlled or denied or judged, or where there was shame and guilt, all the Saturn archetypes, surrounding your will, surrounding your agency, surrounding any beliefs about the nature of free will, the nature of I'm able to have a place in the world if I bring my energy out, if I show myself, right? There is so much authenticity that wants to come through with Aries. It is the first sign, and it's a fire sign. It's so much about the authentic expression of the self. Not yet in that full self-conscious image that Leo can craft and create, but more in the just instinctual go, you need to go. But then again, we are in these funky, murky waters. Saturn and Neptune hanging out at the very, very beginning. Neptune talks about these new mythologies. Saturn talks about new ways in which societies will arrange themselves in regards to this Aries archetype. But where we might also see and find a lot of the tyrant energy, right? The juvenile emperor who was put on the throne too early, rings a bell, rings many bells. It's not just one person. I'm not just referring to any one specific person. There's many. They can be 60 and 70 and 80 years old, and they run the biggest nations in the world. And we see the immaturity. And we see where Saturn will maybe bring very strong checks, very strong karmic balance. It's like, okay, boy, your karma's ripe now. You gotta harvest it. So we'll probably also see that a lot in the world stage, right? Where and how leaders, Aries, will be served their karma, Saturn, right? It's always very interesting to keep the whole sign house of where you've got Aries in your chart in the back of your mind. I really personally only use whole sign houses for specific Hellenistic astrology techniques, even though my focus is definitely more on evolutionary astrology. But when an outer planet changes signs, it is very interesting to keep the whole sign house of your chart in the back of your mind, right? If you're Aries rising, that's your first house. If you're Libra rising, it's your seventh house, right? And then just see what happens around the days, the first week or so when a planet goes into a new sign. We just had Neptune moving there, end of March, and now we've got Saturn moving there. So look at which house, which area of your chart, of your life, is signified by Aries, and pay attention to what will unfold over the next couple of days or the next week or next weeks or so, in regards to get a feeling for what this Saturn and Aries transit is about for you personally, where and how will it ask you to step back into your power, to control your anger, but also craft it, become the master of it, the master of your will, right? To decondition Saturn, all the conditions of where shame and guilt and judgment or feelings of unworthiness have blocked that, where old conditionings, old authority figures, your father, teachers, whatever, have created implants, have created conditionings in your own psyche and in your own mind in regards to standing in your power, in regards to connecting with your anger, in regards to connecting to your agency, to your instincts, to have clear and strong boundaries, where Saturn and Pisces now maybe felt so adrift and no boundaries at all. Saturn and Aries will be so much about protecting our own energetic boundary. But please also be aware of this other side of Aries, where there is just not just instincts and the instinctual energy to go and to express life and life force energy, but also the fear of not being able to do that, which then turns into this very, very aggressive, quote unquote, defensive energy of Aries, which can be very, very detrimental. So also pay very close attention to where and how, and even the most subtle of ways, this kind of defensive energy where you might feel caged in, like somebody's controlling you or your will or who you are, how you want to express yourself, maybe comes up and triggers something deep inside of you, and releasing or relating to parts of you that maybe have felt judged or inhibited by somebody else, somebody from your childhood, an ex-partner, the world, in the past, and how events that maybe unfold now or the coming weeks will mirror that and will ask you to not get into the reactivity of Aries. That's the thing. Aries is action, but it's also the reaction. And the reactivity is an unconscious process where we don't even take a moment to pause Saturn to become still and silent and really hold our own, but can just very instantly react. And that is a very unconscious process often. Right, and any person with very strong Aries might know that from themselves, right, where they maybe jump too quickly and too fast into something, and it's like, ooh, I've got to backpedal on that, right, and make up for all the very fast forward movement that I gave into something. Saturn will ask us to be very wise and cautious also with applying our will, but it will still demand that we do apply our will, right, and come into greater idea of agency, free will, co-creative energy with the world, right? That our agency and will has a place here. Anyhow, this was much longer than I thought. This was a long and in the end still very brief overview over some of the things that you might be able to see playing out with Saturn in Aries in the next days, in the next weeks. There's more to come. Once I find the time, I'll share a bit more on it. Yeah, much else is moving in the sky right now, but we're gonna leave it here. Just some personal and some collective reflections on Saturn and Aries, the end of the Saturn and Neptune cycle, and so on and so forth. So thank you so much for listening. Let me know what's your experience, how you feel, how do you notice this showing up in your own life. Share a story if you like in the comments. I would so appreciate that. If you feel like subscribing to my channel, I also would so appreciate that. And yeah, wishing you a lot of clarity and a lot of grace and a lot of courage for these times, knowing that we are moving through very pivotal times on planet Earth, but knowing also that we've got a role to play here and we can help our brothers and sisters and families and communities and partnerships and the world to wake up and to get out of these reactivity cycles, out of these delusional cycles of othering and dissociating each other from humanity, right? It's about one humanity. It's about one planet. It's about one love, all the Neptune things. And they really want to blossom as well the next years, right? So please try to be a guardian of that peace, of that light, of that hope. And don't despair. I'm very excited for whatever is coming. I'm not afraid, and I hope you're not either. And if you are, that's also fine. Yeah. Sending you so much love, so much grace, so much blessings, and see you next time. Bye bye.